I wanted to do a shout out to my deceased but dearly beloved PhD advisor in theater, who saw the potential of the crazed ideas that showed up in my first book. He died in 1992, and I gave him the first copy off the press. He was a wonderful guy. So here are some places that have been destinations for me. I have some maps that we can whip through pretty quickly. I welcome you to stop me if anything seems weird. I'm going to show you a few pictures just as eye candy. First, I became entranced in the notion of visual perspective and architecture in theater history. So in addition to my impulses coming from my experience as an actor, I was looking at this theater in particular, the Teatro Olimpico, that had multiple vanishing points of perspective that were actually built out by a scenographer in collaboration with an architect. And this slide represents everything that I cared about when I was writing that book: representation, architecture, forced perspective, and the theater. So moving right along, we have, this is not Teatro Olimpico, this is Ohio State University. So I was working as an actor in traditional theater when I started this particular journey. One of the things that was going on at the time, and I'll talk about it in my map, is that interactive or participatory theater was a big deal on Broadway. This is around 1970. And so a friend of mine and I wrote an outdoor mansion staging from medieval theater production of Robin Hood, where children would come with us and interact with the actors. Here I am trying to direct. You can see the kind of looks I'm getting from the cast and how effective I must have been. Here's Alan Adale, the minstrel, bringing the children into the theater space, which is actually the Ohio State Oval. And we did an original score for this as well. And we did a pretty early version of the 13th century version of the tale. Here's a scene where the children are giving advice to Robin and Marian because they're having an argument. We had a blind audience for this one day, and during one of the broadsword fighting scenes, the kids were saying, "I hear him, he's behind you, he's behind you." You know, it was like major intervention in the action. So that got me interested in interactive drama, that and improvisation. Meanwhile, I had a friend who was working at Battelle Memorial Institute during the Viking mission, and in the dead of night, under the influence of something, we went over there, and he showed me these images coming in from Mars on the screen, and it was like, oh, holy crap. You know, whatever this is, I want a piece of it. So he started a company from Mars to Montgomery. He started a company called Cybervision a year later, which was a little 1802 processor. We had 4 colors. It was, as you can see, the resolution was awesome. And I was doing interactive story design for these guys. We sold 10,000 units, went bust, and then everybody slowly drifted out to Atari. So now I'm going to show you the map, and from now on I've got maps to show you of these various journeys. So here's the map to computers as theater if we're looking at humanities territory and technology territory. Let me take you on a quick walk across the humanities part first. So for me, this starts with acting as the big town, right? I've been doing it since I was 13, and the notion of being able to dive into somebody else's head in life has always been interesting to me. In fact, I was a psych major in college, and when I got a B in statistics, I switched to theater because I figured I'd be learning the same thing without the statistics. And improv was a big deal at the time that I was working in this area, and it became really important in later work. I also have a double MFA in acting and directing, and the strongest influence in directing for me was the Lanterna Magica. Who knows about these guys? They're Czechs, right? I believe, and I remember seeing a performance when I was in the Soviet Union. Can I stand up without messing this up? And an actor was walking across the stage with a round screen in his hand on which a woman was dancing. And it was like, dude, this is 1971. So I went back and produced a version of Alice in Wonderland that was called by the local paper, called me a discotheque entrepreneur, but we had the croquet match was like you'd hit the ball and it would roll into the video, which we had shot in the snow. And, I was really inspired by that kind of technological interactivity, and that's an undergrad. So we're moving right along here. Participatory theater, as I mentioned. Living Theater did a production called Paradise Now in New York, where the actors actually crawled around among the audience, and audience members were asked to come up to the stage and participate. That also happened in Dionysus in '69, Godspell Hair, all those productions at that time were inviting the audience to participate. Of course, the problem was that everybody was kind of nervous, and the guys who would go up there wanted to be jerks. So there was a problem with providing appropriate constraints for audience members to collaborate effectively in these participatory theater adventures. And I found that really interesting as a director. Theater history had a strong influence on me. The Greek theater I wanted to mention. So whenever I went on stage as an actor, I would say, may what I do be good for the whole. And that comes from the theater of Dionysus and the role of the theater in Greek society, where they didn't produce plays in Athens at the theater of Dionysus because people wanted to know how Oedipus turned out, right? They already knew the story. The point of producing the play at that festival was because it was politically relevant to the polis to think about the subject matter of the play, whether it was an old story or a new piece that was commissioned. So there was a civic and religious duty involving the theater, and originally the actors were priests of Dionysus. Most of you know this. But for me, that became a really important connection to civics, to citizenship, and to ethics in my work. Medieval theater, I talked about mansion staging. Commedia dell'arte is sort of the beginning of a notion of character that showed up for me. So I was drawing on those traditions primarily in the work, and of course, in the world of critical theory from Brecht. I'm glad you mentioned Brecht, because I could as easily have written my book about Brecht. Learning, for example, that by doing a production of Threepenny Opera as the world's finest horror, that the action of the play finishes in the action of the citizenry after the play is viewed is an idea that's really similar to the idea in Greek theater of it being a civic and spiritual moment, a duty that's part of the ongoing life of the polis. Aristotle gave me the structure. Then I had a magnificent teacher of the poetics that really helped me to understand material and efficient causality, formal causality, how the structural elements talk to each other in the way the formal system works. Now we're going to go down to technology land real quick. I told you about cybervision and interactive story. Well, I didn't tell you. I was hired to do interactive fairy tales there while I was working on my MFA. So it seemed like, yeah, same thing, right? Because I'm doing Robin Hood over here, and I'm doing, what was it, Beauty and the Beast, I guess, on cybervision. So, in this little, in 2K of RAM with lip syncing. When we got 16K, we said, oh boy, we're going to do War and Peace, So we all went to Atari, but the really interesting thing about Atari was going to Atari Labs with Alan Kay, who had been stolen from Xerox, tempted by a big budget to come over and run a really interesting lab. There I ran into all these smart young people from the architecture machine group. In fact, I was only one of two people who wasn't one of those guys. And I can remember having to fight with Alan to go to SIGGRAPH because I wasn't from MIT. But those guys brought in all this information about presence, telepresence, remote presence. Michael Neymark, Scott Fisher, Rachel Strickland. There were a bunch of great people in that crop, and they're still around, and they're still doing cool stuff. Bookmark, I have a new piece by Rachel Strickland that's an app on iPad that is a visual experience like none you've ever seen. I'd be glad to demo it to anybody while I'm here. And this was there's a little town here called Norman. That's Don. Don gave me the opportunity to publish a paper that was the precursor to Computers as Theater in a book in 1986, I think. And was a guy like my advisor in theater. Don was this psychology dude who was giving me some, yeah, this sounds good. So that's how we got to, I guess, and Little Computer People. Does anybody remember that?
Yeah.
Yes? Rich Gold designed this, and it was that I produced it for a while at Activision. And there was this little guy in the game who had a living room and a bedroom and a piano and a kitchen, and you had to like take care of him. You know, bring him, send him to the grocery, or bring him groceries, or play with him sometimes. And if you didn't, he'd take to his bed, and then he'd pass away. But if you did take care of him, he'd play the piano and sing. Well, we had trouble because the salesman could not demo this product at trade shows because they would let the poor fucker die. They just couldn't pay attention to him. They were too busy. So we had to make a special version where he was just miraculously, his life was extended. But this notion of an autonomous guy, you know, where you're just reaching through the screen doing stuff, gave me the sense that we needed to reach our hand through the damn thing. At the time I was working, it was a barrier. You know, you could do that maybe, but not very well. It was more like that. And for women, that involves a mental rotation and a translation, and it is not good for our. Anyway, the Guides project was an interactive agents project for the encyclopedia, and all this stuff led to the production of this book. Which turned out to influence some people, and it certainly turned out to influence me. Now, I found, so you can see that random exploration has just turned into seeing through structure on the theater side, on the humanities side, and experience on the computer side. And that those things sort of collided on accident for me. But from then on, what I want to say, you talked about legacy and lessons. So the lesson of this first thing is that structure and experience, juxtaposing those two, is really important to my process. But I wanted to say that in terms of, quote, legacy, I don't know, man. My legacy is what happened next for me, and I'm going to show you a couple quick more maps, if that's okay, that carry some of these ideas forward. So this is funny, that the guys at MIT thought not MIT, excuse me, Addison Wesley thought this first cover was too coded. They thought it was too hard to interpret. So the paperback was this completely silly cover that had nothing to do with anything. I don't know.
What's a great Mondo?
My Mondo picture, right? So the continuation of this trajectory for me happened in Banff. This is a map of Banff, Alberta. BRA. And for me, it was like, okay, let's just do this thing. You know, I could see it. I could figure out kind of how it would work. What would it take? You know, I want to be inside a different body. I want to be in a different place. I want this to feel like acting. But I want it to be magical in ways that theater can't, you know. And there were these guys doing VR. I went to see them at NASA, Scott Fisher's lab. They were doing vector stuff at first, and then we got fat polygon. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the thing that started bringing me in here was the notion of authorship, which I had already been struggling with in the world of games. Obviously, you're giving away formal control if you use an Aristotelian mechanism. You're giving away part of your formal control to your players. And so you're left with authorship as an exercise in authoring environments and using the other elements and the force of material causality to create situations and circumstances that predispose people to make choices that are dramatically interesting. And that's hard. And so I was focusing on that shared authorship issue and looking at virtual reality and also on material causality. My friend Rachel and I became entranced with the notion of thinking about landscape and narrative and juxtaposition. She's an architect from MIT, and I'm just this guy, you know. And we had a mutual love affair with Barry Lopez, whom I actually finally got to meet and correspond with in recent years. It's very exciting. If you haven't read him, do. He's probably the best nature writer in the world right now. He's in the Edward Abbey seat, only maybe even better. Anyway, we decided to use Banff as a staging ground to examine this business of how does narrative relate to landscape. You know, how do these things inform each other, which you can obviously see is related to technology. We had the notions that come to us from architecture of making a space to be inhabited as opposed to making a backdrop or a display or a frame. And you know, we all saw that change happen in architecture, and it became really important to me. And also the question of point of view. Are we still really talking about engineering single vanishing point perspective, for example. And how do you think about foveation in a world that has the limitations of a screen? Okay, we worked a lot with collaboration. This is the first time I'd had any really hardcore down, in it collaboration with serious engineers. What came out of the design process there was we reframed our goal. We decided that what we were doing with Placeholder, which is the name of the virtual reality project, was creating an example that would tell a new story about what the medium was capable of. So our enterprise became the production of a design statement, as fully fleshed out as we could make it. And of course, I learned a lot about parallax and proprioception and stuff. I'll talk to you about it. There's the little town of Leary down here had something to do with this journey. I think I stopped there for gas a few times. So I had my problems with VR. If you recall, you had one glove and you had a little language, right? I want to go this way, so you'd go this way. Or you could go here and you could get a menu in cyberspace. Now, why the fuck do you bother to model a space if you've got a drop-down menu? What? What is that? So one of the things we discovered was that they were taking intended direction of movement from the helmet. So what we did was we split that up. We said direction of movement comes from the pelvis, it never lies. Direction of gaze comes from the head, so you could now do this, right? And then we gave you two hands, so you could do this. And it completely changed the kinesthetic sense of where you were in a virtual environment. Polygons, this is just to say we experimented with different ways of capturing the scene. So we did tiled video, we did polygon-based stuff, but we used primarily audio cues in one of the environments. And we did virtual relief projection of video in another environment. And one of the things that was cool about it was this notion of immersion and direct manipulation where, we took Don to the extreme, right? I want to be in there. I want to be able to grab stuff like a rock that has a mouth that I can tell a story to, and I can put it here. And when somebody else comes in, they can touch it and hear my story. And so what ended up happening was that people were doing narrative lattices and stuff. And I'd go in like the janitor at night and sweep out all the crap like, Cindy was here, and I'd throw it in. But it sort of accreted in a neat way, anyhow. So what we did was to tell the story to change the perceived purpose of the medium from training, which was what it was exclusively used for before this and a few other projects, to dreaming. And a year later, Shar Davies was doing Osmos and had a much larger audience for it, but we feel very proud that we got this started. And in fact, to be embodied in this space, you had to intersect with the body of an animal, and you took on some of its perceptual and motor characteristics. So the question of embodiment became deliberately inhabiting a character from a first-person point of view. Now, when I was at Atari and driving games and stuff, you were watching yourself from, out-of-body sort of experience, and we really wanted to play around with that. So what we ended up with was Placeholder, and this is just a little collage of, so here, instead of diving into the dream, we're telling a new story. I already told you that. Here's a little collage. So you can see on the top, this is the virtual relief projection of the waterfall. That's video. On a good day, we were running at 12 frames a second. That's the map of the territory. Here's some of the character bodies, spider and snake, that you could step into. It was a 2-participant system. I believe that was revolutionary about it as well. And you could only see the other guy if they embodied as an animal. So there were all kinds of fun things going on with that. Quickly, I'll give you a real quick journey through Rutland. This is where games were in a rut. So I was lucky enough to land a job at Interval as a result of the MANF project, and going through the humanities piece, I got deeply immersed in gender studies, play, culture, brain-based sex differences, which we hadn't been allowed to talk about out loud in the 80s, right? But we could now in the 90s. I looked at ethnographic methods and learned a lot about them as a result of working with design research partners on a project to investigate how to improve the likelihood of girls engaging with technology. And we knew that we wanted to do that through play, but we weren't sure that we wanted to do that through what you or I would have then called a game. because there were some characteristics of games that it turned out didn't work so well for girls, including this translation, mental rotation. Girls, it turns out, tend to be body-centric navigators, right? Girls, it turns out, tend to be less expert at mental rotation under time pressure. So you put those two things together and you're dead with the side scroller, right? It just isn't going to work for a girl. So the time pressure goes away, the side scrolling goes away, and then we're looking for content that's more engaging with the whole sort of strategy of getting girls' hands on the machine. At this time, we weren't thinking about starting a company. But we did interviews with 1,000 girls between 7 and 12 across the country. With art, we played around with different styles for the characters at different stages of their lives and in different game series, and found out a lot about that. I got very involved in the ethics of this project, as you might imagine, because it was about empowering girls on two levels. One was to get their hands on the computer, but the other was the content itself, which was engaged girls in the kind of emotional rehearsal space that they need at a tween age in order to become successful as teenagers. There's this moment where tween girls who believe that everything that happens to them is inevitable, where they need to learn that they could hypothesize about outcomes. If you've raised a kid, you probably know this is true of boys as well, but for girls it's acute because of all the covert competition and social pressure that they face in their lives. So there were two sort of ethical goals there for me in doing this work. And so we ended up with an investigation of the strategy and tactics for accomplishing these things. I read Sun Tzu, I read Liddell Hart, I talked to my husband who's a military historian, I went back to Aristotle. And I realized that one grand strategy, we usually think of a grand strategic goal being served by multiple strategies. In fact, one strategy can serve multiple grand strategies. So, if you're designing, let's say for Nike, let's say you design Nike Town, right? Your grand strategic goal is over here saying, I'm going to lift up sports as a means to self-esteem in this community, and I'm going to pay the price of working with this host organism, right? Same strategy serves Nike. I'm going to make a boatload of money, right? Sometimes you've got to do that kind of deal with the devil. And sometimes it's not the devil. Sometimes it's, two different goals that are equally virtuous, and you have to figure out a strategy that can fit them. So being able to invert strategically the way we were approaching the problem turned out to be really important. I'll move really quickly here. The perception of the platform in these days actually turned out to be that girls thought video games were for boys and that personal computers were for everybody. So that was interesting to learn. Now, of course, it's entirely different. There's no gender associations that I know of in any of the media that we're working with today. I mean, hardware systems. The big invention here was emotional navigation. That is the ability to make choices by hearing the inner thoughts of the protagonist and deciding which way you felt. And that would unroll another piece of action. We're still at nodes, right? We're still at branching trees. Sorry, this is a long time ago. But there was no way to win this game. There were just some very groovy Easter eggs, and sometimes whining worked. We ended up with a lot of products. I learned a lot about distribution and economics. It turned out because we had hard goods in warehouses, the investors thought, gee whiz, we can invest in this company over here that doesn't have to have inventory and doesn't even have a business plan. And one day they said, you're in Chapter 7. And it was like, because we had been in the top 100 games for a couple of years. And it turned out that Mattel eventually acquired and killed the label. We did learn about transmedia. This was in the days of roll your own web retail. Did I just do that gesture? You couldn't get something off the shelf that was going to, allow people to buy stuff. We had a website that took contributions from users. It was a secure environment. There was a panic button. It was a social network. They traded treasures that were virtual versions of the actual objects that came in the boxes. So there was this array of materiality and virtual scarcity that we were working with, as well as social networking. In fact, after we had to close the site because of this bizarre eruption on the part of our board, about 280 girls joined the site because it was still running under the goodbye screen, because they were coming in with their friends. And we also discovered about 6 black market sites that were trading, that figured out how to clone and trade rare treasures. So I think of it as a cultural success. And so my conclusion, my learning there is that, cultural intervention at scale is possible. I've been fooling around with cultural intervention. Let me define that. Cultural intervention is introducing new genetic material into a culture without activating its immune system. So to get away with this, I figure, is a success. But seriously, we're talking stealth here. Okay. So here's some quick pictures from Purple Moon. We introduced it at E3. This is my daughter in slavery as the youngest booth babe at the show. She just had a baby 2 weeks ago. These are our products, some of them. We had, so that's, excuse me, that's what happened there. And I just spilled coffee on my computer, so I'll just move it. Hi, Brenda. Good. I have a brown skirt. What I got to do is I got to write a book about this, thanks to Doug and Peter Lunenfeld. And so now when I get fan mail, which I do about 3 or 4 times a week from girls who are like, I'm a college student and designer, I can send them this and say, this is how the sausage was made. And it sort of brings up all the ethical and business issues and questions of leadership, and hopefully I can get to continue to have a relationship with some of these young women, which is very cool. We're going to not take this interlude. I spent 12 years in higher ed. Here is the secret sauce. Read it fast! Okay. Last map. This is my map that I'm on now, since I left academia after 12 years. And this is a map from Gulliver's Travels. I bet you recognize it if you're from California. Cape Mendocino, New Albion, North America. I love the little whale down there. So here's where I'm going now, I think. Uh-oh, that's just a warning. I'm looking at the eyes of the world. You remember the Mars story. I'm looking at the eyes of the world. And it's not just a Grateful Dead song. And for a change, I'm going to start on the technology level. Distributed sensing has been going on for a long time. People running simulations based on real-world sensor data to give us information about weather and ocean temperature and pollution. This is not a new technology. Distributed computing, you all know about, the SETI project, protein folding, et cetera, that's going on, where people are basically donating home CPU time to help solve problems that even can't be solved by supercomputers at this point. These are in the trajectory for me. Mobile devices is huge, enormous. The fact that we are now all carrying a Cray around in our pocket, and that you can attach anything to it. Augmented reality, being able to see through augmented reality in particular, being able to, it's like X-ray vision, but different. That's a completely new way of seeing. And it involves questions of foveation and computer vision and point of view. So when you have, let's say, a bunch of data coming in from mobile devices looking at a field, what does that map look like? Barry Lopez said something really interesting to me. He said, in American art, when a painting doesn't have a vanishing point, we call it primitive. Mm-hmm. And he suggested that we ought to call it community art. And so one of the things that's really driving me right now is to figure out what do those representations look like. And really being inspired by the work of Deborah Astrid and others in the world of participatory computing, where we all decide we're going to measure some stuff with different sensors and create a collective map of this beautiful planet we live on. So that's the science part. That's ways of seeing. And really quickly, the monster in the room is climate change. I cannot grasp that people are still in denial about this. I cannot grasp that we are over the tipping point. The sadness is so profound in me. Maybe we're not. I've been profoundly influenced by Lovelock. I don't know if you've read his last book, The Vanishing Face of Gaia. The Gaia Hypothesis is now mainstream science. Do you guys know that? It's not woo-woo anymore, right? It is actually basically a good model of what's going on here. And what's at risk is the homeostatic tendency of the whole system as we begin to see species crash and temperatures change. People are in denial about this. How is that possible? It's possible because the discourse sucks. It's possible because it's the other. It's over there. Climate change is over there. Technology's over there. Art's over there. Ethics is over there. Religion is maybe in here. We've othered it. We've othered climate change. We've othered the technology that might solve it. We've othered the human enlightenment agency to go out and take action on it. We just put it over there as the other. I'm telling you, there ain't no other. There ain't no other. We talk about the Greek model of the polis, where people had individual agency that resulted in policy and good governance. We tried to do that here in this country. Many of us have had visions of this happening in the world. What is missing in this picture? A notion of the good that we can all hang on to, that we can all believe in? Doesn't the good involve a healthy planet? What up? I'm sorry, I'm preaching, but the reason this is happening, I think, is the spectacle. Is helping us other it. And that navigating and piercing the spectacle is increasingly important. We're dealing with a third generation of Americans who have been robbed of the capacity for critical thinking by the spectacle. We don't have too many chances left to have informed citizens. If you put the media together with a lack of critical thinking skills, you're in deep trouble. So what do we do about that? What can we do about that? I'm getting back to my question of what does the community map look like? But at the end of the day, I guess I'd call it an enterprise in Gaian gardening, which may involve geoengineering and all kinds of other stuff. But what I'm interested in is mindfully seeing this world in a different, deeper way so that what's going on is incontrovertibly understandable and it reaches us in the heart and we realize we belong to it. And we are so in love with it that we cannot fuck it up. That's my goal right now. Anybody want to fund that? Here, quick movie treat. This is how we may act is what I'm calling it. Okay, so I talked about Albion. So here's Albion. This is a 20-second movie. My husband and I do environmental recordings and play Tibetan bowls in strange places. This is a cave in Van Dam State Park, if you've been there. So you can hear the water outside. Yummy. Okay, thank you. I just blah, blah. Thank you.